What I'm about to tell you is the most satisfying revenge story you'll ever hear, and every single detail is absolutely true. This is the story of Sarah Martinez, a dedicated accounting manager who discovered her boss wasn't just stealing credit for her work, he was stealing millions of dollars from their company. And when he made the fatal mistake of calling her worthless in front of the entire office, Sarah didn't just get mad. She got even in a way that would send him to federal prison. My name is Sarah Martinez, and 3 years ago, I was working as a senior accounting analyst at Morrison Financial Services, a mid-sized investment firm in downtown Chicago. I had been there for 6 years, working my way up from junior accountant to senior analyst, and I genuinely loved my job. I was good with numbers, great at spotting discrepancies, and had a reputation for being thorough and reliable. But there was one problem: my boss, Richard Morrison, yes, the same Morrison whose name was on the building. Richard was the son of the company founder, and he had inherited his position rather than earning it. While I was working 50-hour weeks and catching financial irregularities that saved the company hundreds of thousands of dollars, Richard was taking credit for my work and treating me like I was invisible, but calling me worthless in front of 43 employees during our monthly staff meeting. That was the biggest mistake of his life, because what Richard didn't know was that for the past 8 months, I had been unknowingly documenting the largest financial fraud scheme in our company's history. And when he humiliated me that day, I realized exactly what I had been looking at. This isn't just a story about workplace revenge. This is a story about a $2.1 million embezzlement scheme, federal investigations, and how one moment of cruelty led to a complete destruction of a man's life, career, and freedom. Let me paint you a picture of Morrison Financial Services. From the outside, it looked like the perfect mid-sized investment firm, located in a glass tower in Chicago's financial district, with 85 employees managing over $200 million in client assets. The company had been founded in 1987 by Robert Morrison, Richard's father, who had built it from a 2-person operation into a respected financial services firm. Robert Morrison was everything his son wasn't: honest, hardworking, and genuinely respected by his employees. When Robert retired in 2019 and handed the reins over to his 38-year-old son Richard, many of us were cautiously optimistic. We thought maybe Richard would step up to the responsibility. We were wrong. Richard Morrison was the textbook definition of a nepotism hire who had never worked anywhere else. He had an MBA from an expensive private school that Daddy had paid for, but zero real-world experience. He had spent his entire career at Morrison Financial, moving up through positions he hadn't earned, taking credit for other people's work, and coasting on his father's reputation. But here's what made it worse: Richard was insecure about his lack of real expertise. So he compensated by being a bully. He would belittle employees in meetings, take credit for successful projects, and blame others when things went wrong. And for some reason, he seemed to have a particular problem with me. Maybe it was because I actually knew what I was doing. Maybe it was because clients would sometimes ask for me specifically when they had complex financial questions. Or maybe it was just because I was a woman who didn't bow down to his authority. Whatever the reason, Richard Morrison made my work life increasingly miserable. Now let me tell you about myself. I'm Sarah Martinez. I was 31 years old at the time of this story, and I had worked in financial services for 9 years. I started as a junior accountant right out of college, earned my CPA certification, and had built a reputation for being incredibly thorough with financial analysis. I was the person they called when the numbers didn't add up, when auditors were coming, or when clients had complex questions about their portfolios. I wasn't the type to make waves or cause drama. I kept my head down, did excellent work, and tried to stay out of office politics. But I was also naturally curious about discrepancies, and had this annoying habit of following paper trails until I understood exactly where every penny was going. That habit was about to change everything. The first sign that something was wrong came in March 2021. I was preparing quarterly reports for our biggest clients when I noticed something odd in the management fees. According to our standard fee structure, we charge clients 1.25% annually for portfolio management. But when I ran the numbers on several major accounts, the fees being charged didn't match our stated rates. At first, I thought it might be a software error or a miscalculation. So I pulled the actual client contracts and compared them to the fees being charged. That's when I discovered that we had been charging some clients 1.75%, a full half percent more than they had agreed to pay. A 0.5% might not sound like much, but when you're managing $200 million in assets, that extra 0.5% represents over $1 million per year in unauthorized fees. I brought this discrepancy to Richard's attention in a private meeting. I had prepared a detailed analysis showing the fee discrepancies across 12 major accounts, with documentation proving that we were charging more than the contracted rates. Richard's response was dismissive and condescending. "Sarah, I appreciate your attention to detail, but you're not seeing the big picture here. These are legacy fee adjustments that were approved at the executive level. You don't need to worry about things above your pay grade." But I knew our client contracts. I had helped prepare most of them. There were no legacy fee adjustments that would justify charging clients more than their signed agreements specified. So, I started digging deeper. What I found over the next several months would eventually bring down Richard Morrison and result in the largest financial fraud case in our industry that year. I want to be clear about something. I wasn't intentionally investigating Richard Morrison. I was just trying to do my job correctly. But the more I looked into these fee discrepancies, the more questions I had. The first major red flag came when I tried to reconcile our client fee calculations with the actual payments being deposited into our operating accounts. According to our internal records, we should have been receiving approximately $2.5 million annually in management fees, but our bank deposits showed we were actually receiving over $3.1 million. That's a $600,000 difference that couldn't be explained by normal business operations. I started tracking this discrepancy systematically. Every month, I would compare our stated fees with our actual deposits, and every month, the gap was getting larger. By June 2021, we were collecting almost $750,000 more in fees than our client contracts specified. But here's what made it really suspicious. This extra money wasn't showing up in our company's official financial reports. According to our quarterly statements to the board of directors and our annual reports to shareholders, our fee income was exactly what it should have been based on our client contracts. So where was the extra money going? I spent weeks trying to trace these discrepancies through our accounting system. What I discovered was a masterclass in financial manipulation. Richard had created what accountants call a parallel accounting system. On the surface, everything looked normal. Client contracts specified 1.25% management fees. Our official reports showed income consistent with those rates, and our external auditors saw books that appeared completely legitimate. But underneath, there was a second set of transactions happening. Richard had been systematically contacting our largest clients and convincing them to sign amended fee agreements. These amendments increased their management fees to 1.75%. But Richard was telling clients that the increases were temporary market adjustment fees that would be refunded at the end of each fiscal year. Of course, these refunds never happened. Instead, Richard was depositing the extra fees into a separate business account that he controlled personally. This account was set up under the name Morrison Advisory Services, technically a different legal entity, but one that only Richard had access to. Every month, Approximately 60,000 to 80,000 in unauthorized fees was being diverted into this personal account, and it had been happening for almost 2 years. But the fee overcharges were just the beginning. As I dug deeper into our financial records, I discovered that Richard was also manipulating our expense reports. He had been creating fake vendor invoices for services that were never provided, approving payments to shell companies that he controlled, and even billing personal expenses to client accounts. I found invoices for consulting services from companies that didn't exist, software licenses for programs we didn't use, and professional development expenses that were actually payments for Richard's country club membership, luxury car payments, and family vacations. The most brazen example was a 47,000 invoice for financial software upgrades that was actually the down payment on Richard's new Mercedes-Benz. By August 2021, I had documented evidence of over $2.1 million in fraudulent charges, unauthorized fees, and diverted funds. All of it traced back to Richard Morrison. But I made a crucial mistake. I thought I could handle this internally. I scheduled a meeting with Richard in early September to present my findings. I had prepared a comprehensive report showing every discrepancy, every unauthorized fee, and every suspicious transaction. I thought that confronting him with irrefutable evidence would force him to come clean and return the stolen money. I had no idea how wrong I was. When I walked into Richard's office that Tuesday morning, carrying my evidence folder, I thought I was having a conversation with someone who would be ashamed of being caught. Instead, I was walking into a trap that would change everything. September 7, 2021, 9:30 a.m. I knocked on Richard Morrison's office door, carrying what I thought was enough evidence to end his criminal activity and get justice for our clients. Instead, I was about to learn that Richard Morrison was far more dangerous than I had realized. "Come in, Sarah," Richard said with that fake smile he always used when he wanted something. "I understand you wanted to discuss some accounting issues." I sat down across from his massive mahogany desk and opened my folder. "Richard, I've discovered some serious discrepancies in our client fee structure and expense reporting that we need to address immediately." His expression didn't change, but I noticed his hands tighten slightly on his coffee cup. I began presenting my evidence methodically. I showed him the fee comparisons, the bank deposit discrepancies, the fake vendor invoices, and the trail of money leading to his personal accounts. For 20 minutes, I laid out a case that would have convinced any reasonable person to confess and cooperate. Richard listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding as if he was taking my concerns seriously. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and was quiet for several long seconds. Then he started laughing. "Sarah," he said, still chuckling, "I have to admire your thoroughness. You've clearly put a lot of work into this investigation. But I think you're misunderstanding some complex financial arrangements that are frankly above your level of expertise." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Richard, these aren't complex arrangements. These are unauthorized charges to client accounts and diverted company funds. We're talking about over $2 million in what appears to be embezzlement." His expression turned cold. "Be very careful about the accusations you're making, Sarah. Embezzlement is a serious criminal charge, and making false accusations against your superior could be considered defamation." "These aren't false accusations," I replied, showing him bank statements. "I have documentation for every transaction. The money trail is clear and undeniable." That's when Richard's mask completely came off. "Let me explain something to you, Sarah," he said, leaning forward with genuine menace in his voice. "I am the owner of this company. My name is on the building. These financial arrangements you're questioning were approved by me, for the benefit of the company, and are completely legal. But the clients don't know about the fee increases," I protested, "and these expense payments are going to your personal accounts." The clients are getting excellent service and market. Beating returns, Richard snapped. And as the owner and CEO of this company, I am entitled to compensation that reflects the value I provide. If you can't understand basic executive compensation principles, maybe you're not as qualified for your position as you think you are. I realized that Richard wasn't just denying the fraud. He was actually convincing himself that he had done nothing wrong. In his mind, being the boss gave him the right to take whatever he wanted. Richard, I said as calmly as I could, this isn't about executive compensation. This is about charging clients fees they didn't agree to pay and billing personal expenses to company accounts. That's fraud, regardless of who does it. Richard stood up abruptly. This meeting is over, Sarah. I want you to forget about these so-called discrepancies and focus on the work you're actually paid to do. And I want you to destroy any documentation you've created related to this matter. I can't do that, I said. We have a fiduciary responsibility to our clients, and you have a responsibility to follow my instructions, Richard interrupted. And if you can't do that, maybe we need to reconsider your employment here. It was a direct threat. Comply with the cover-up, or lose my job. I gathered my papers and stood up. I need some time to think about this. You have until tomorrow morning, Richard said. Come in prepared to tell me that you understand your role here, or come in prepared to clean out your desk. I walked out of that office, knowing that Richard Morrison had just made the biggest mistake of his life. He had given me an ultimatum, but he had also confirmed everything I suspected. He wasn't going to stop the fraud voluntarily, and he was willing to threaten employees who discovered it. But Richard made one crucial error in his calculations. He assumed that I would be intimidated by his threats and would choose to keep quiet to protect my job. He had no idea that I had already been documenting everything and that I was far more committed to doing the right thing than I was to keeping a job, working for a criminal. What happened next would turn my evidence gathering from an internal company matter into a federal criminal investigation. The next morning, September 8th, 2021, I walked into Morrison Financial Services, knowing that my life was about to change dramatically. I had spent the entire night thinking about Richard's ultimatum, and I had made my decision. I was not going to participate in covering up a $2.1 million fraud scheme. But I also wasn't going to quit and walk away. Instead, I was going to do something that Richard Morrison would never expect from someone he considered beneath him. I was going to take detailed notes of everything that happened and document his response when I refused to cooperate. At 9 a.m., I knocked on Richard's office door. "Come in, Sarah," he said with that same fake smile. "I trust you had time to think about our conversation yesterday." "I did," I replied, setting a small digital recorder on his desk. "And I want to make sure I understand your position clearly." Richard looked at the recorder suspiciously. "What's that for?" "This is a conversation about my job responsibilities and potential termination," I said. "I want to make sure I have an accurate record of what's discussed, which is my right under company policy." Richard didn't like it, but he couldn't object without seeming suspicious. "Fine. So what's your decision?" "Sarah, my decision is that I cannot and will not ignore evidence of financial irregularities that appear to violate our fiduciary duties to clients. I believe we need to report these discrepancies to our compliance department and external auditors immediately." Richard's expression hardened. "So you're choosing to be insubordinate and refuse a direct order from your supervisor?" "I'm choosing to follow proper financial reporting procedures and regulatory requirements," I replied calmly. "Sarah, let me be absolutely clear with you," Richard said, his voice getting louder. "There are no financial irregularities. There are only complex business arrangements that you lack the experience and expertise to understand. Your job is to process numbers, not to question strategic decisions made by management. My job as a CPA includes identifying and reporting potential compliance violations, I responded. And what I've documented appears to meet the definition of. What you've documented, Richard interrupted, is a collection of normal business transactions that you've misinterpreted. Because you don't understand high-level corporate finance. This is exactly why people in your position need to stay in their lane and not try to do jobs they're not qualified for. I could feel Richard's frustration building, but I stayed calm and professional. Can you help me understand how charging clients fees above their contracted rates constitutes normal business transactions? That's when Richard made his fatal mistake. He stood up from his desk, walked around to where I was sitting, and looked down at me with pure contempt. Sarah, I'm going to explain something to you very simply, because apparently you're not getting it. You are a mid-level accountant. You process payroll, reconcile accounts, and prepare basic reports. You are not a financial strategist, you are not an executive, and you are not qualified to question decisions made by people who actually understand how this business works. Then, he paused, took a deep breath, and delivered the line that would destroy his life. If you can't understand that, then maybe you're just too worthless as an employee to work here. The word worthless hung in the air like a physical presence. Richard had just called me worthless. In his own office, while being recorded, as part of a conversation about refusing to participate in covering up financial fraud. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what happened next. Richard was so angry that he decided to make his point publicly. He stormed out of his office and into the main work area, where most of our staff was working at their desks. "Attention everyone," Richard announced loudly. "I want you all to witness what happens when an employee thinks they know better than management and refuses to follow direct orders." The entire office, 43 people, stopped working and looked up. Richard pointed at me as I walked out of his office. "Sarah Martinez has decided that she's qualified to question strategic business decisions and financial arrangements that are frankly beyond her level of understanding. She seems to think that her job title gives her the authority to challenge executive decisions." The office was completely silent. People were looking between Richard and me with obvious discomfort. "So I want everyone to understand," Richard continued, "that employees who think they're smarter than their supervisors, who refuse direct orders, and who try to do jobs they're not qualified for, are worthless to this organization. And worthless employees don't belong here." He had just called me worthless in front of the entire company, while most of them knew I was one of the most competent and dedicated employees at Morrison Financial. But Richard wasn't finished. "Sarah, you have until 5 p.m. today to decide whether you want to be a team player who focuses on her actual job responsibilities, or whether you want to clean out your desk and find employment somewhere else. The choice is yours." Then he walked back into his office and slammed the door. I stood there in front of 43 coworkers who had just watched their CEO humiliate me for refusing to ignore what appeared to be criminal fraud. Some of them looked sympathetic, others looked embarrassed, and a few looked angry on my behalf. But they had no idea what they had just witnessed. They thought they had seen a boss disciplining an insubordinate employee. What they had actually seen was a federal criminal creating evidence of retaliation against a whistleblower who was about to expose the largest embezzlement scheme in the company's history, because that digital recorder had captured every word of Richard's tantrum. And in about 6 hours, that recording was going to be in the hands of the FBI. By 2 p.m. that same day, I was sitting in the Chicago field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, speaking with Special Agent Jennifer Walsh of the White Collar Crime Division. I had called the FBI tip line immediately after Richard's public humiliation, and Agent Walsh had agreed to meet with me that afternoon. "I want to be clear about something," I didn't go to the FBI to get revenge on Richard Morrison. I went to the FBI because I had documented evidence of what appeared to be a multi-million-dollar fraud scheme. And Richard had just made it clear that he had no intention of stopping the criminal activity or returning the stolen money. Agent Walsh was a sharp, professional woman in her early 40s who specialized in financial crimes. She listened to my entire story without interruption, occasionally taking notes as I explained the fee discrepancies, the fake invoices, and the money trail leading to Richard's personal accounts. When I finished, she asked the question I had been hoping to hear. "Do you have documentation for everything you've told me?" I opened my briefcase and handed her copies of everything I had compiled over the past 6 months. Bank statements showing the deposit discrepancies, client contracts compared with actual fees charged, fake vendor invoices for services never provided, and the complete paper trail showing 2.1 million in unauthorized transactions. But the most important piece of evidence was the digital recording of Richard's threats and his public humiliation of me for refusing to participate in the cover. Up. Agent Walsh listened to the recording twice, taking detailed notes. When it finished, she looked at me with the expression of someone who had just heard a confession. "Ms. Martinez," she said, "this recording contains what appears to be evidence of obstruction of justice, witness intimidation, and retaliation against a potential whistleblower. Combined with the financial documentation you've provided, this gives us probable cause to begin a formal investigation." She explained what would happen next. The FBI would conduct a preliminary review of my evidence to determine if it supported the opening of a criminal case. If it did, they would begin a full investigation that could include search warrants, forensic accounting, and interviews with other employees. "I need to warn you," Agent Walsh said, "that once we open a formal investigation, your life is going to become very complicated. You'll likely be terminated from your job, you may face legal threats from your employer, and you'll probably need to testify in federal court if we find sufficient evidence for criminal charges." "I understand," I replied, "but I can't let this continue. Our clients are being defrauded, and Richard Morrison is stealing millions of dollars." Agent Walsh nodded. "Give me 48 hours to review your documentation and get approval from my supervisor. Don't do anything at work that might alert Morrison to this investigation. Act normal, and whatever you do, don't confront him again or give him any reason to suspect you've contacted law enforcement." I agreed and left the FBI office, feeling both relief and terror. Relief that I had finally done the right thing by reporting the fraud, and terror about what was going to happen to my life and career. But I had no idea how quickly everything was about to escalate. The next morning, September 9th, I arrived at work to find Richard Morrison in an unusually good mood. He greeted me with a big smile and asked if I had reconsidered my position about the accounting discrepancies. I told him I was still reviewing the situation and needed more time to understand the transactions I had questioned. Richard seemed satisfied with this response and told me to take all the time I needed. What Richard didn't know was that while he was being friendly and accommodating, the FBI was conducting a preliminary review of my evidence and discovering that the fraud was even more extensive than I had realized. Agent Walsh called me that evening with an update that changed everything. "Ms. Martinez, we've completed our initial review of your documentation. Not only do we believe you've uncovered a significant embezzlement scheme, but our forensic accountants think the total amount stolen may be closer to 3.2 million when we include transactions you haven't discovered yet." She explained that the FBI's white-collar crime unit had been expanded. The next is Martinez had painstaking fraudulent records. Richard had been manipulating corporate accounts for almost 3 years. Not the 2 years I had documented. "We're opening a formal criminal investigation effective immediately," Agent Walsh continued. Tomorrow morning, we'll be serving search warrants on Morrison Financial Services, Richard Morrison's personal residences, and all bank accounts associated with Morrison Advisory Services. My heart started racing. What should I do? Report to work normally. The search warrants will be executed at 8 a.m. sharp, before most employees arrive. We'll need you to provide access to the financial records and computer systems, and we'll want you available for questioning throughout the day. Will Richard be arrested? That depends on what we find during the search and whether he cooperates with the investigation. But based on the evidence you've provided, he's likely to be charged with multiple federal crimes including wire fraud, embezzlement, and obstruction of justice. I hung up the phone knowing that September 10th, 2021 was going to be the most dramatic day in Morrison Financial Services history. And I was right. September 10th, 2021, 7:55 a.m. I was sitting in my car in the Morrison Financial Services parking garage, waiting for the FBI to execute their search warrants. Agent Walsh had instructed me to arrive early and wait for her signal before entering the building. At exactly 8:00 a.m., 3 black SUVs pulled into the parking garage, followed by a white forensic accounting van and 2 marked FBI vehicles. 12 federal agents, wearing bulletproof vests with FBI, in large yellow letters, walked purposefully toward the building entrance. Agent Walsh approached my car and knocked on the window. "It's time, Ms. Martinez. We're going to need your help accessing the computer systems and locating the financial records." I walked into Morrison Financial Services, behind a team of FBI agents carrying search warrants, forensic equipment, and evidence collection materials. It was the most surreal moment of my life. The first person we encountered was Janet, our receptionist, who took one look at the FBI agents and immediately called Richard's office. "Mr. Morrison, there are federal agents here with search warrants." We could hear Richard's voice through his office intercom. "What? That's impossible. There must be some mistake." Agent Walsh walked directly to Richard's office and knocked on the door. "Mr. Morrison, I'm Special Agent Walsh with the FBI. We have federal search warrants for these premises, your personal residence, and your financial records. I need you to step out of your office immediately." Richard opened his door looking confused and angry. "This is outrageous. What is this about?" "Sir, you're not under arrest at this time, but you need to cooperate fully with this search. We're investigating allegations of financial fraud, embezzlement, and related federal crimes." I watched Richard's face as the words financial fraud and embezzlement registered. His eyes immediately found me standing behind the FBI agents, and his expression changed from confusion to pure rage. "Sarah," he said, pointing directly at me, "you did this. You called the FBI." Agent Walsh stepped between Richard and me. "Mr. Morrison, I need you to remain calm and cooperate with this investigation. Any threats or intimidation of witnesses will result in additional charges." "Witnesses." Richard's voice was getting louder. "She's not a witness. She's a disgruntled employee who doesn't understand complex financial arrangements." "Sir, we have recordings of your conversations with Ms. Martinez, and we have extensive financial documentation that appears to support her allegations. I strongly recommend that you contact an attorney immediately." By this time, other employees were arriving for work and discovering that their workplace had been turned into a crime scene. FBI agents were photographing everything, collecting computer hard drives, and boxing up financial records. The forensic accountants went directly to our main server room and began copying our entire financial database. Other agents were in Richard's office, photographing documents and collecting his personal computer. Richard stood in the middle of the office, watching federal agents systematically collect evidence of his crimes, and I could see the moment when he realized how much trouble he was in. "I want to speak to my attorney," he said quietly. "That's your right," Agent Walsh replied, "but this search will continue whether you have counsel present or not." For the next 6 hours, I helped FBI agents navigate our computer systems, explained our accounting procedures, and provided context for the financial records they were collecting. I showed them how Richard's fee manipulation scheme worked, where the fake invoices were stored, and how money was being diverted to his personal accounts. The forensic accountants discovered transactions I hadn't found, including a complex scheme where Richard was artificially inflating the value of client portfolios to justify higher management fees, then pocketing the difference. By 2 p.m., the FBI had filled 17 boxes with evidence and copied over 2 terabytes of financial data. Richard had been sitting in the conference room with his attorney for most of the day, watching his entire criminal enterprise being systematically documented and collected. Agent Walsh approached me as the search was concluding. Martinez, based on what we've found today, will be recommending federal charges against Mr. Morrison. The evidence you provided was accurate, but it was actually only about 60% of the total fraud we've now documented. How much money did he steal? I asked. Our preliminary estimate is $3.4 million over 3 years. But we won't have a final number until we complete the forensic analysis of all the bank records and client accounts. As the FBI agents were packing up their evidence, Richard Morrison approached me one last time. His attorney was standing right behind him, probably trying to prevent him from saying anything else incriminating. "Sarah," Richard said, and I could hear genuine desperation in his voice. "You have no idea what you've done. You've destroyed this company. You've destroyed people's jobs. All over some accounting discrepancies that could have been resolved internally." I looked at him for several seconds before responding. "Richard, you stole $3.4 million from clients who trusted you. You committed federal crimes for 3 years, and when I tried to report it internally, you called me worthless and threatened to fire me. The only thing I did was refuse to participate in covering up your crimes." Richard's attorney pulled him away before he could respond, but I could see in his eyes that he still didn't understand the magnitude of what he had done. In his mind, he was the victim of an ungrateful employee who had betrayed him. But his delusion was about to collide with federal justice. 3 weeks later, Richard Morrison was indicted on 14 federal charges including wire fraud, embezzlement, money laundering, and obstruction of justice. His bail was set at $500,000, and he was forbidden from accessing any Morrison Financial Services accounts or contacting any current or former employees. The company's assets were frozen pending a complete audit, and all 84 employees, including me, were laid off while federal investigators tried to determine how much money could be recovered for defrauded clients. But my story was just beginning. Richard Morrison's criminal trial began on March 15, 2022, in the United States District Court for the Northern District of Illinois. By that time, the FBI's investigation had uncovered the full scope of his fraud scheme, and the numbers were staggering. Over 3 years, Richard had stolen $3.7 million from Morrison Financial Services and its clients through a complex web of fee manipulation, fake invoices, and diverted funds. The forensic accountants had identified 247 separate fraudulent transactions, all of which led back to accounts controlled by Richard. But the financial crimes were only part of the case against him. The prosecutors also charged Richard with witness intimidation and obstruction of justice, based on the recording I had made of him, threatening me for refusing to participate in covering up the fraud. That recording became the centerpiece of the government's case. I testified for 2 full days as the prosecution's primary witness. I explained how I had discovered the fee discrepancies, documented the money trail, and attempted to report the fraud internally before Richard threatened and humiliated me. The defense attorney tried to portray me as a disgruntled employee who had misunderstood legitimate business practices and was seeking revenge against a boss who had criticized my work. But the financial evidence was overwhelming, and my testimony was supported by bank records, client contracts, and forensic accounting analysis. The most damaging moment for Richard came when the prosecutors played the recording of him calling me worthless. In front of the entire office. The jury could hear the contempt in his voice, his admission that he had threatened my job, and his demand that I ignore evidence of financial irregularities. Richard's attorney had advised him not to testify on his own behalf, but Richard insisted. He spent an entire day on the witness stand trying to justify his actions as legitimate executive compensation and complex financial arrangements that were misunderstood by his employees. The cross-examination was devastating. "Mr. Morrison," the prosecutor asked, "did you have authorization from your company's board of directors to increase client fees above their contracted rates?" "I am the CEO and majority owner of the company. I have the authority to make strategic decisions about fee structures." "That's not what I asked, sir. Did you have specific board authorization to charge clients more than their signed contracts specified?" "Well, no." "But did you inform clients that their fees were being increased? The increases were temporary market adjustments that would have been refunded." "Sir, did you inform clients that their fees were being increased? Yes or no?" "No." "Did you ever refund any of these unauthorized fee increases to clients?" "The refunds would have been processed at the end of the fiscal year." "Mr. Morrison, did you ever refund any unauthorized fees to any client? Yes or no?" "No." "And where did this money go?" "It was held in a separate account for administrative purposes." "An account that only you controlled?" "Yes." "An account from which you made personal purchases including a Mercedes, Benz, country club memberships, and family vacations." Richard's attorney objected, but the damage was done. Richard had essentially confessed to stealing client money on the witness stand. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all 14 counts. At his sentencing hearing 2 months later, Richard Morrison stood before federal judge Patricia Coleman and heard the consequences of calling me worthless and trying to cover up his crimes. "Mr. Morrison," Judge Coleman said, "you held a position of extraordinary trust and responsibility. Your clients entrusted you with their life savings, their retirement funds, and their financial security. Instead of honoring that trust, you systematically stole from them for your own personal benefit. When a dedicated employee discovered your crimes and tried to report them internally, you threatened her employment and publicly humiliated her. You showed no remorse, no willingness to return the stolen funds, and no recognition of the harm you caused to your victims. The court sentences you to 8 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. You are ordered to pay $3.7 million in restitution to your victims, and you are permanently barred from working in the financial services industry. Richard Morrison, the man who had called me worthless, was led away in handcuffs to begin an 8-year prison sentence. But the consequences for Richard went far beyond his criminal conviction. Morrison Financial Services was permanently closed, and its assets were liquidated to pay restitution to defrauded clients. The Morrison family lost the business that Richard's father had spent 34 years building. Richard's personal assets were seized by federal marshals, including his house, his Mercedes, Benz, his boat, and his investment accounts. His wife filed for divorce 3 months after his conviction, taking custody of their 2 children and what remained of their non-criminal assets. Richard Morrison went from being a multimillionaire CEO to being a convicted felon with no money, no business, no family, and no future in the only industry he had ever worked in. All because he made the mistake of calling me worthless, for refusing to participate in covering up his crimes. While Richard Morrison was beginning his 8-year prison sentence, I was discovering that being a federal whistleblower comes with its own set of challenges and rewards. The first challenge was finding new employment. When Morrison Financial Services was shut down, all 84 employees lost their jobs. Most of them were able to find new positions relatively quickly, but my situation was more complicated. On one hand, I had a reputation in the financial services industry as someone with exceptional integrity who had done the right thing under difficult circumstances. On the other hand, some employers were hesitant to hire someone who had brought down their previous company, even when that company was engaged in criminal activity. I spent 4 months unemployed, living on savings and wondering if my decision to report Richard's crimes had destroyed my own career. But then something unexpected happened. I received a phone call from Margaret Chen, the managing partner at Chen and Associates, one of Chicago's most prestigious forensic accounting firms. Margaret had followed Richard's trial in the financial press and was impressed by my testimony and the quality of evidence I had compiled. "Sarah," she said during our first interview, "what you accomplished at Morrison Financial Services was remarkable. You conducted a forensic investigation that was more thorough and professional than what we see from many trained investigators. We'd like to offer you a position as a senior forensic accountant." The job offer was for 40% more money than I had been making at Morrison Financial, with the opportunity to specialize in fraud detection and white-collar crime investigation. I accepted immediately. Over the next 2 years, I worked on some of the most high-profile financial fraud cases in the Midwest. I helped uncover embezzlement schemes, Ponzi schemes, and corporate accounting fraud that totaled over $50 million in stolen assets. My expertise in tracing complex financial transactions and my experience testifying in federal court made me one of the most sought-after forensic accountants in the region. But the most satisfying part of my new career was the impact I was having on other potential whistleblowers. Word had spread throughout the financial services industry about how I had exposed Richard Morrison's fraud scheme. I started receiving calls from accountants, analysts, and other financial professionals who had discovered suspicious activities at their own companies and wanted advice on how to report them safely. I helped dozens of people navigate the process of reporting financial crimes to federal authorities, and many of those reports led to successful investigations and prosecutions. In 2023, I was invited to speak at the National Association of Certified Public Accountants annual conference about fraud detection and whistleblower protection. My presentation, titled "When Your Boss Calls You Worthless," a case study in financial crime reporting, was attended by over 800 accounting professionals. During the question and answer session, a young accountant from Detroit raised her hand. "Ms. Martinez, I'm in a situation very similar to what you experienced. I've discovered what appears to be embezzlement at my company, but I'm afraid that reporting it will destroy my career. How did you find the courage to do the right thing?" I thought about her question for several seconds before answering. "The courage didn't come from being brave," I said. "The courage came from realizing that I could not live with myself if I allowed the fraud to continue. When Richard Morrison called me worthless for refusing to ignore his crimes, he made it clear that he valued his personal wealth more than his clients' financial security. At that moment, I knew that staying silent would make me complicit in his crimes." "But what about the personal cost?" she asked. "You lost your job, went through a federal investigation, and had to testify in court." "That's true," I replied. "But the personal cost of staying silent would have been much higher. I would have had to live with the knowledge that I had the power to stop a criminal from stealing millions of dollars from innocent people, and I chose not to act. That's not the person I want to be." After my presentation, I was approached by a reporter from the Wall Street Journal who was writing a follow-up story on white-collar crime prosecutions. She asked me if I had any regrets about exposing Richard Morrison. "Only one," I told her. I regret that I tried to handle it internally first, instead of going directly to the FBI. If I had reported the fraud immediately when I discovered it, Richard might have stolen less money, and more of it might have been recovered for the victims. What would you say to Richard Morrison if you could speak to him today? I thought about that question for a long time before answering. I would tell him that calling me worthless was the biggest favor he ever did for me. It clarified exactly who he was and what he valued, and it gave me the motivation I needed to make sure that justice was served. His contempt for me became the foundation for his own destruction. 3 years after Richard Morrison began his prison sentence, I received a letter that brought this entire story full circle. The letter was from the Federal Bureau of Prisons, informing me that Richard Morrison had requested to include me on his approved correspondence list. Apparently, he wanted to write to me from prison. I was curious about what he might have to say after 3 years of federal incarceration, so I approved the request. His letter arrived 2 weeks later. Dear Sarah, it began, I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I've had a lot of time to think about what happened at Morrison Financial Services, and I wanted to reach out to you. The letter went on for 3 pages. Richard wrote about how prison had given him time to reflect on his actions and their consequences. He acknowledged that he had stolen money from clients, threatened me for trying to report his crimes, and destroyed the company his father had built. But the part of the letter that struck me most was near the end. Sarah, I realize now that when I called you worthless, I was actually describing myself. You were trying to protect our clients and preserve the integrity of our company. I was the one who was worthless as a leader, worthless as a fiduciary, and worthless as a human being who had been entrusted with other people's money. I know I can never undo the damage I caused, but I want you to know that your courage in reporting my crimes probably prevented me from stealing even more money and hurting even more people. You did the right thing, even when it was difficult and dangerous. I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me someday, not because I deserve forgiveness, but because you deserve the peace that comes with letting go of anger. The letter was signed, with regret and respect, Richard Morrison. I read that letter several times, trying to decide how I felt about it. Was this genuine remorse, or was Richard trying to manipulate me even from prison? Ultimately, I decided it didn't matter. Whether Richard's apology was sincere or calculated, it couldn't change the fact that he had committed serious crimes and had been held accountable for them. The justice system had worked. The stolen money was being returned to victims, and other potential fraudsters had seen the consequences of financial crimes. I wrote back a brief response. Richard, I appreciate your letter and your acknowledgement of the harm you caused. I hope you use the remainder of your sentence to become the person you should have been when you were in a position of trust and responsibility. I forgive you, not because you've earned it, but because holding on to anger would only hurt me. I hope you understand that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, and it doesn't mean that there shouldn't be consequences for criminal behavior. You called me worthless for trying to do the right thing, but in the end, doing the right thing gave my life more meaning and purpose than I ever expected. I wish you well in your efforts to rebuild your life after prison. 6 months later, I received another letter from Richard. This one was much shorter. Sarah, thank you for your grace and forgiveness. I am using my time in prison to earn a bachelor's degree in social work. When I am released, I plan to work with nonprofit organizations that help people who have been victims of financial crimes. I want to spend the rest of my life trying to repair some of the damage I caused. You were right to report my crimes, and I was wrong to call you worthless. You are the opposite of worthless. You are invaluable to anyone who cares about justice and integrity. I never wrote back to that second letter, but I kept it as a reminder of how this story had evolved. Richard Morrison had gone from being a millionaire CEO who thought he was above the law to being a federal prisoner who finally understood the value of the person he had tried to destroy. Meanwhile, I had gone from being an accountant who was called worthless for doing the right thing to being a respected forensic investigator whose work had helped recover tens of millions of dollars in stolen assets and had inspired other professionals to report financial crimes. The man who had tried to silence me by attacking my worth had inadvertently given me a platform to do more meaningful work than I had ever imagined possible. Today, I run my own forensic accounting firm specializing in fraud detection and whistleblower support. My company has helped uncover over 200 million in financial crimes and has provided guidance to hundreds of people who have discovered suspicious activities at their workplaces. I speak regularly at conferences, universities, and professional organizations about the importance of financial integrity and the protection of whistleblowers. My story has been featured in multiple books about white-collar crime and has become a case study in business ethics courses. But the most important outcome of this entire experience is the knowledge that I helped protect innocent people from a criminal who was stealing their money and destroying their financial security. Richard Morrison called me worthless for refusing to participate in his crimes. But in the end, refusing to accept his definition of my worth became the foundation for building a career dedicated to fighting the exact type of crimes he committed. Sometimes the greatest revenge isn't getting even, it's proving that the person who tried to destroy you was completely wrong about who you are and what you're capable of achieving. Richard Morrison is scheduled to be released from federal prison in 2029. He will be 47 years old, with no money, no business prospects, and a federal felony record that will follow him for the rest of his life. I will be 42 years old, running a successful business, respected in my industry, and proud of the work I do every day to protect people from criminals like the man who once called me worthless. That's not revenge. That's justice. So what can we learn from the story of Richard Morrison and the 3.7 million fraud scheme that he thought he could cover up by calling me worthless? First, document everything. The reason I was able to provide the FBI with such compelling evidence wasn't because I was trying to build a case against Richard. It was because I had a habit of keeping detailed records of everything I worked on. When Richard's threats made it clear that he wouldn't address the fraud voluntarily, I already had months of documentation ready to present to federal investigators. Second, never let anyone define your worth based on their criminal behavior. When Richard called me worthless for refusing to ignore his crimes, he was actually revealing his own moral bankruptcy. People who are threatened by your integrity will often attack your character because they can't attack your facts. Third, sometimes doing the right thing requires accepting short-term costs for long-term benefits. Reporting Richard's fraud cost me my job and put me through months of uncertainty, but it led to a career that has been more meaningful and financially rewarding than anything I could have achieved by staying silent. Fourth, the justice system works, but only when people are willing to use it. Richard Morrison stole $3.7 million and might have continued stealing indefinitely if someone hadn't reported his crimes to federal authorities. Criminals count on good people staying silent out of fear or inconvenience. And finally, bullies and criminals often reveal their true nature when they're threatened. Richard Morrison's decision to publicly humiliate me for questioning his fraud scheme gave me the motivation I needed to take action and provided prosecutors with evidence of witness intimidation. His cruelty became the instrument of his own destruction. Richard Morrison called me worthless for refusing to participate in covering up his crimes. But what he didn't understand was that my worth wasn't determined by his opinion. It was determined by my actions when faced with a choice between right and wrong. Today, Richard Morrison is serving the 6th year of his 8-year federal prison sentence. He lost his business, his family, his fortune, and his freedom because he thought he could intimidate someone into ignoring his crimes. I am building a business, helping victims of financial fraud, and working every day to make sure that people like Richard Morrison are held accountable for their actions. He called me worthless. The justice system called him guilty. I know which judgment I'd rather live with. What do you think? Was my response to Richard's fraud and bullying justified? Should I have tried harder to resolve the situation internally before involving federal authorities? And have you ever been in a situation where someone tried to silence you for doing the right thing? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of workplace justice and financial crime investigations. Because in the end, the truth always wins. It just sometimes needs help from people who are willing to fight for it, even when powerful people call them worthless for refusing to stay silent. Your worth isn't determined by bullies who are threatened by your integrity. Your worth is determined by your willingness to do the right thing, even when it's difficult, dangerous, and costly. Richard Morrison learned that lesson the hard way, and now he has 8 years in federal prison to think about it.